Shabbos Daf Chaf begins with a Mishnah and takes us to the end of the parak and begins the next one. The Mishnah discusses four situations in which there is a Gzeira D'Rabbanan, a rabbinical decree that you should not start something to be working on the fire because you may come to stoke the coals under the fire, which is a similar continuation to our previous Mishnah, which was a Machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about setting up something to run before Shabbos. Setting up something before Shabbos, which will run over Shabbos. The Gemara will discuss the details of each of the cases in the Mishnah and when each one is permitted. The Gemara will specifically spend a while discussing when you want to light a fire for heat or for light, how much of the fire has to catch depending on the different material that you're burning. The Gemara will have a number of different examples. That'll take us to the end of the parak, and we'll preview the next parak at the end of this one. So first of all, let's see the Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses four cases which there is no Machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Everybody agrees that there's a potential concern that you may stoke the coals in this fire which is working for you, and therefore you have to make sure that you have a situation set up over here where you will not want to play around with the fire. So the four cases that are discussed are as follows. First of all, if you are roasting meat, eggs, or onions, so you have to make sure that it's roasted enough before Shabbos that you will not have a desire to stoke the coals to make it roast faster on Shabbos itself. The Gemara will define how well done it has to be before Shabbos begins. The next case is if you have bread in an oven. Now, bread, the way it was baked in an oven in the days of Chazal, an oven was a somewhat cone-shaped clay structure, and there was a fire built out of wood at the bottom, and bread was stuck to the sides of the oven, of the clay structure. And it would stay on there until you were ready to peel it off when it was finished, fully baked. So how baked does it have to be that you will not have a desire to stoke the coals to make it bake faster? Here we have a machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanna Kama says it has to crust over, the surface has to become hardened, it has to develop a layer. And Rabbi Eliezer says the bottom has to develop a layer, and we will have a discussion in the Gemara what that refers to. The next case is if you are trying to roast the carbon Pesach. So here we actually say that it's mutter. You're allowed to put the carbon Pesach into the oven to roast, even if it's just before Shabbos, and it's not going to be ready before Shabbos begins, but you're allowed to lower it in there, and this is more lahakel than the case we had earlier of roasting meat. And then the fourth case here is if you want to light a fire. So here we have a distinction between whether it's the fire in the Beis HaMikdash, which is the chamber where Kohanim would sleep in the Beis HaMikdash. There we say that you're allowed to light the fire, even close to nightfall, even though it's not really caught on the wood. We're not afraid that you're going to fool around with the wood in order to make the fire catch well. However, in the rest of Eretz Yisrael and even outside Eretz Yisrael, you would not be allowed to light the fire unless it is going strong and is a healthy fire before Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Yehuda notes that in certain materials, you don't have to worry about the fire catching. So, for example, if you're lighting a fire on charcoals, then it's permitted even though it's just lit a little bit because it's going to grow healthily. You don't have to worry that it's going to die out. Now, the Gemara is going to refer to each of the cases, and the Gemara is going to try to figure out what is the level of completion that has to be accomplished on each of these so that you would not want to increase the fire. So first of all, the Gemara discusses roasting meat, eggs, and onions. How well does it have to be done? So the Gemara gives a famous rule over here. It has to be completed to the level of Michael ben Drusai. Ben Drusai was a bandit. He was always on the run, and therefore he ate his food somewhat raw. Rashi defines Michael ben Drusai as being 1/3 cooked. That's how ben Drusai used to eat it. There are other Rishonim who hold that it is half cooked. Now the Gemara quotes a couple of other halachos which also use the din of ben Drusai, 1/3 cooked. So the Gemara says that the same halacha applies to bishul akam. The halacha is that a Jew is not allowed to eat food which is cooked by a non-Jew. However, if the non-Jew only cooked it after a Jew had already cooked it to the point of ben Drusai, then the non-Jew's cooking is insignificant because the Jew already made it the level of ben Drusai. What the non-Jew added does not make the food usur. Similar halacha to our Mishnah, the Gemara quotes from Daf Lamed Vav, which we'll see at length when we get there. As far as the halacha of shehiyah, leaving food on the fire, Hananiah says that as long as it is cooked to the level of Michael ben Drusai, as long as it's 1/3 cooked, you don't have to worry about shehiyah, and it's okay, you could leave it there even if the coals aren't covered or sealed, and you don't have to worry that you're going to come to stoke the coals. Very similar halacha to our Mishnah here. Now the Gemara goes on to the next case of the Mishnah, which was bread. And we had a machlokes. The Tanna Kama said it's got a crust, and Rabbi Eliezer said the bottom has to crust. So the Gemara says, what does it mean that the bottom has to crust? The bottom refers to the surface of the bread that's stuck onto the wall, or the bottom refers to the bottom part of the bread, which is closer to the ground, closer to the fire, which is in it. That the wall of the oven is sloped, so the surface, which is closer to the bottom half of the bread, is facing down, it's facing the ground. That's not the part of the bread which is stuck to the wall. So which one is it when he says it has to be the bottom? Which one is he referring to? This is where he says, Rabbi Eliezer, in a brisa, clearly says that it's got to be the layer which is stuck to the wall of the oven. When we say the bottom surface, we mean the surface which is stuck to the wall. It's called the bottom because when you peel it off, it'll be the bottom of the bread. Now, there's some discussion here amongst the Rishonim whether he means that even the bottom has to be crusted, not just the top, which is a bigger chumrah, meaning it has to be more well done than the Tanna Kama who said only the top has to be encrusted, or is he just saying that either layer would be encrusted, that would be enough? Okay, now the Gemara goes to the discussion of Korban Pesach, what you saw in the Mishnah. We said that is mutter, even though it's not ready before Shabbos, it's not Kamechel Ben Drasai, it's mutter, we don't have to worry about it. So the Gemara wants to know why. So the Gemara first says because the people of the Korban Pesach, the Chabura that gets together to bring the carbon, they are Zrizin. They are going to, they keep halacha very stringently, and they're going to be there to remind each other not to touch the fire, especially because it's Shabbos, and you're not allowed to touch the fire on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. But now you're telling me that the reason why it's permitted is because the people of the Chabura will remind each other not to touch the fire. That seems to imply that if it was any other kind of similar case, which wasn't a Korban Pesach, so for example, if you had another young goat or sheep under a year old that you were roasting in an oven, that would be usher, because you don't have the fact that the people are going to remind each other. But hold on a second, didn't we see earlier halacha that you don't have to worry about stoking the coals in a case where you have young goat meat, because the air that gets in when you open the fire will damage the meat, and therefore you would not want to open the oven in order to stoke the coals, so it's not a concern. So how come over here the only reason is because of the Bnei Chabura that will warn each other? It should be permitted even without that, because you don't want the air to get in to damage the meat. So the Gemara says no, that's in a case like we discussed earlier where the meat is just a piece of meat, it's cut up, so it's extra sensitive to the air that gets in. There, you could say this svara that if you open the oven, it's going to damage the meat, and therefore you're not going to open the oven, so we don't have to worry about it. However, the Korban Pesach is roasted whole in one piece. Therefore, the air that gets in is not going to damage it. And if not for the fact that the people of the Chabura would remind each other, it would still be forbidden, because it would be nothing to prevent you from opening the oven. Okay, the Gemara now goes further. The next thing we saw in the Mishnah was about lighting the fire. That you're allowed to light the fire in the Beis HaMikdash of the Beis HaMikdash just before Shabbos. So the Gemara says, how do you know? What's the source of this? And because it says, you're not allowed to light a fire in your house. It's only in your house you're not allowed it's only in your house you are not allowed to light a fire, but in the Beis HaMikdash you are allowed to. The Gemara says, hold on, that doesn't make sense. If you're allowed to light a fire in the Beis HaMikdash, this pasuk is telling you that it's also to light a fire on Shabbos. If that's saying that it only applies in your house, that means that in the Beis HaMikdash you're allowed to light a fire even on Shabbos. This Mishnah didn't say you're allowed to light a fire in the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash to keep you warm, and only said you're allowed to do it just before Shabbos. So the Gemara says that pasuk is not referring to this. That pasuk is talking about burning the parts of the karbonos on the mizbeach. You're allowed to do that Friday night. You're allowed to light a fire. You're allowed to do what would be Chilul Shabbos outside the Beis HaMikdash. Here, the reason why this is permitted is because Kehanim Mazrizim. Kehanim are going to take care of each other. They're going to keep an eye on each other and make sure they don't come to violate any of these halachas. The Gemara now refers to the next halacha in the Mishnah, which was that outside the Beis HaMikdash, you aren't allowed to light a fire unless it is majority already lit. Otherwise, we're afraid you're going to fiddle with the fire to make sure that it's a strong fire. So the Gemara says, what does it mean that it's majority lit? So a few opinions here. Rav says it means that of all the pieces of wood that are in the fireplace, the majority of them must be on fire. Shmuel says, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means you have to have a healthy fire there, that there is no concern that somebody will say, bring more kindling so that we can build a stronger fire over here. Now, the Gemara brings a brayso that supports Shmuel. It's not clear what this brisa is referring to. Rashi has some discussion whether it's referring to the menorah, or the wicks of the menorah, or it's referring to a bonfire. But Reb Chia says in this brisa that it should, whatever it is, should be lit so that the flame can rise on its own and it doesn't need any help. So that's pretty much like the way Shmuel was explaining it. Now the Gemara discusses the case if you have one single large piece of wood. So then what would Rav say? What is the majority there? So Rav says that means that the fire has to go mostly across the thickness of the wood, and some say that it has to go all the way around the wood. It has to go the majority of the way around the wood, the circumference of the wood. And Rav Papa says, since we don't know which one it is, it's got to be the two of them. It's got to be most of the way through the wood and most of the way around the thickness of the wood. Now the Gemara says seems to be a Machlokas Tanaim. We have a brisa that says, quotes Reb Chia, that a single thick piece of wood should be burned to the point where it's ruined for a craftsman to use. That's when it's most of the way through. Rav Yehuda ben Pseira says that the fire has to be burning on both sides of it. That means that it's at least most of the way around, and it's more than 180 degrees around. So that way it's on both sides. Now the Gemara says that there's a hint to this entire discussion. There's a pasuk in Sefer Yecheskel, it's referring to Klal Yisrael, gives a mashal, and it says that Shnei Ketzayis of Achla Eish, its two ends have been burned by fire, v'teichei nachar, and the inside has been dried out. Hayitzlach lemalacha, could that still be used for work? So you see that if it's burned most of the way through, it cannot be used for work anymore. Now the Gemara gets into another discussion about a similar thing. We have the word ha'ach. When Yirmiyahu brought a Megillas Eicha to show to Yoyakim the king, he was sitting in front of the fireplace, it says, and the ha'ach was burning. What's ha'ach? What's ach? So Rav says it's achvana, it's arovos. Shmuel says it means that the sticks were burning in brotherhood, which means that the thin sticks were catching the thicker sticks onto flame. And the Gemara shows that ach means achvana. There was somebody who was walking around saying, who wants to buy achvana? And he was actually selling aravos. The Gemara has a discussion of, is it easier for fire to catch on things which are bundled together, or is it easier for it to catch on things that are spread apart? So we have three opinions over here. The discussion is concerning reeds and discussing the date pits. So according to Rav Huna, as long as they are bundled together, it's harder to catch, and it's got to be roiv. It has to be majority caught. According to Rav Chizda, no. If it's more scattered, it's harder to catch, and that's when you need roiv. If it's together, you do not need roiv. And according to Rav Kahana, it depends which one you're referring to. If you're referring to sticks, he also like Rav Huna that it's harder to catch when it is bundled together because the fire can't get in. And if you're talking about the date pits, it's harder to catch when they are scattered apart, because they'll go out each on their own. Now the Gemara lists several materials which burn so quickly that you do not have to have them be majority on fire before Shabbos, and they are as follows. You have tar, sulfur, cheese, grease. In Brisa it adds straw and twigs. And the Gemara says, Rav Yechanan says wood from Bavel. The Gemara says, hold a second, wood from Bavel, what's that referring to? If it's referring to the thin strips of wood that we often use, so that's not true, because the wick of a candle, of an oil lamp, has to be majority lit before Shabbos, and that's more flammable than those strips of wood. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what it's referring to. It's referring to cedar trees, which burn even more easily than soaked wicks, or Rami Rabbah says, referring to moss. That's the end of the parak, and that takes us to the next parak, which is called Bameh Madlikin. The next chapter contains the halachos of what we may use to light the Shabbos candles. Now the main concern over here is that the flames should burn clearly and brightly so that you would not be tempted to adjust them on Shabbos, which would be a malacha d'oraisa of Mavir. So the Mishnah begins by listing all the types of wicks we cannot use because they do not burn correctly and properly. And then it goes on to the types of oils which we shouldn't use. So first of the types of wicks we shouldn't use, the Gemara will define all of these, so we're just going to list it. You have lechesh, which is some type of a cedar tree, choisen, flax, chalach, a type of silk. Psilos idon is a wick made from willow. Psilos midbar is something from the desert. Yeroikesh al pnei hamayim is algae. Now, oils, you can't use pitch, which is tar. You can't use wax. You can't use something called shem and kick, which is kick oil. The Gemara will explain it, of course. You can't use oil which is supposed to be burnt. You shouldn't use the fat of a sheep's tail. And you shouldn't use chaylev, which is forbidden fats of an animal. Now, about chaylev is a bit of a discussion over here. We saw one opinion. Nachum Hamadi says you can use it if it was boiled, and the Chachamim say you can't use it no matter whether it's boiled or not. The Gemara will explain how that's different than the first opinion. Now let's see the Gemara which defines each of these. Okay, now the Gemara defines each of these. So lechesh and psila sa'idon, the Gemara says, is a woolly substance which grows on trees. One is in between the bark and the wool of a cedar tree, the bark and the wood of a cedar tree. One is between the bark and the wood of a willow tree. Then the Gemara says, what's chosin? The Gemara says, this is the part of the flax that you break off when you're combing it out, the thin broken fibers. The Gemara says that can't be, because that's called na'ires, and we have a pasuk which refers to chosin and na'ires as two separate things. So the Gemara says, Abaye says that it's flax stems that aren't processed fully, and therefore it doesn't draw oil well. Okay, next the Mishnah wants to know what's kalach. Marsa Shmuel said that some sailors told me that that's called kulcha. It's a type of thing that grows on rocks in the ocean. Yitzchak Bar Zir said it's a low-quality silk that's made from silkworms. Now the Gemara says that Ravin disagreed. Ravin held that it was regular silk, and he was once sitting with Abaye in front of Rabbanan Nechemia, who's the brother of the Reish Galusa, the head of the Kehila in exile, and they saw he was wearing a silk thing. So they began to discuss it in halacha. Ravin said, this is silk, this is the kalach that's in the Mishnah, meaning he held that the kalach is regular quality silk. Abaye said, no, this is not it, this is paranda silk, meaning this is normal quality silk, but the Mishnah was talking about low quality silk. So the Gemara says, we asked the Brisa against Ravin, who says that kalach is regular silk. It can't be, because we have a Brisa which lists regular silk and kalach and sirkin, and it says that they're all chayav in a tzitzit. So you see it lists regular silk and kalach differently. So kalach must not be regular silk, it must be lower quality silk. So Gemara says, okay, you're right, it's a kasha on Ravin, but then the Gemara defends him and says, no, maybe what Abaye was saying was that the silk that the brother of the Reish Galusha was wearing was super high quality silk. But regular silk is not the same as that, and that's not what Rabbanan Nechemia was wearing. He was wearing the higher quality silk. Now the Gemara refers to the woolly stuff that's in a willow tree and a arava tree. The Gemara says that Ravin and Abaye were walking, and Ravin said to Abaye, this is the arava tree that the Mishnah was referring to. And Abaye said, what do you mean? That's a tree. How do you make wicks out of a tree? So he peeled off the bark and showed him there's this woolly substance between the bark and the wood of the tree. Next, the Gemara says, what's psilas hamidbar? It's a type of tall grass you can braid and make into wicks. Now, what about the green stuff that's on the water? The Gemara says it can't be referring to algae. That can never be made into a wick. It has to be referring to moss that grows on the bottom of a boat. And the Gemara says, some other brisa has another thing here, wool and hair you can't use for wicks. The Gemara says that our mission did not have that, because you can't possibly make those into wicks. Wool curls up and hair just burns. Now, next in the Mishnah we had zephes. The Gemara says that is tar, and shiva is wax. And the Gemara says, there was a Tana who says that the first part of the Mishnah is all a list of wicks, and the second part is a list of oils. The Gemara says, what? Very funny. That's obvious. Well, I need you to tell me that for. What he's trying to tell you is that when we say that shiva, that wax is no good, that's only if you're using the wax as an oil. If, however, you use the wax wrapped around the wick in what we call a candle, that's okay, because that works very well. Next, the Gemara says, itron is a product which was made from distilling the tar, and wax is something which comes from when you get honey out of the honeycomb. What's left over is called wax. The Gemara says, why do I need to know that? We already said what these things are. The Gemara says this is defining it as far as if somebody contracts to sell it, that's all he has to give. It does not have to process it any further than that.